So this is one case of this idea of this miraculous infusion of what we can call the unlimited into the limited parameters of nature, where the entire community, God specifically says that the entire community should gather in this small place, and they did. It worked. This is, in a way, is similar, and the Talmud compares it also to the idea that when we talk about in our daily prayers 3 times a day, we talk about our hope and our trust and anticipation of Mashiach, of a better world. And that's one of the fundamentals of our faith. There's a fundamental of our faith also, as Mendy put them out, 13 fundamentals of the faith. The 13th, as he lists it, is believing that when the Mashiach comes, there's a resurrection of the dead. It means all your ancestors are going to, again, be living. And the physics question of that is, how does it work? Talk about population explosion. How could that possibly work? And the Talmud says that the space will expand so that there's room for everyone. That's not a normal physics answer. But again, there's the idea of God is not bound by the limits of physics. Now, why does God want everyone there? And there are a few possible angles on it. One that we can talk about is that just on the human level, it's like the psychology of things. People tend to be suspicious of the boss. And therefore, when you look at Moses is in power. Moses is literally coming and talking, from the mountain, from God. So even though they do rebel against Moses, and he, as the Torah tells us, he's not immune to criticism, but where a place that they could certainly pick on was his family. And the idea of him giving power to his family, which is, it's not only a problem today when you look at nepotism and how people in positions of power unfairly might bring friends and relatives into positions of power. But for thousands of years, this has been a suspicion because it makes sense. There's a certain natural propensity to corruption that people have when they have an opportunity. So the idea of Moses giving the position of high priest to his brother, it would understandably be suspect. So we stood at Sinai, people would say, we stood at Sinai, and God spoke to us, and God said, trust Moses. We got no choice. But now you come along, and you say, now there's going to be a second power center here, and it's going to be my brother. You got everything. You're consolidating everything. There's no checks and balances. So God said, I am going to be very clear in my presence in the dedication of the Kohanes. I want everybody here. I don't want anyone to say, I'm not, this doesn't smell right to me. God will be putting his stamp of approval on this. So God, what did Moses do? He says to the community, God's there in verse 5, this procedure which you're about to witness is what God commanded me to do. I'm not doing this for my own glory or for that of my brother Aaron, but only because God commanded me to do it. Moses brought Aaron and his sons forward and immersed them in the water of a mikveh. The term mikveh doesn't show up here in the scripture itself. That's why it's not bolded, but that's what it means, immersing them in water. This is something, the idea of what we call a mikveh today, and what we're building here outside is the idea of this process for elevating ourselves, purifying ourselves, and it's a big part of the temple service. And here they have to go into the mikveh. He dressed Aaron with the trousers, placed the tunic upon him, girded him with the sash, clothed him in the robe, placed the ephod upon him, girded him with the belt of the ephod, which was right, which was like the apron, by tying his two ends together and adorned them with it. He placed the breastplate upon him and inserted the Urim and the Tumim into the breastplate. We studied quite a while ago the Urim and Tumim. We're not 100% sure what that was, because it does Urim and Tumim. Tumim are not normal Hebrew words, but we'll go with this idea that within the breastplate, which had holy and precious stones on it, each one reflecting different words, reflecting the 12 tribes. There was the name of God written on a piece of paper and Kabbalistically powerful and inserted between the folds so that the stones would light up and communicate to the Kohen and to the high priest when he asked God for guidance. Placed the turban on his head, and he placed the golden forehead plate, the holy diadem suspended by a cord, placed over the turban, resting on his head below the front of the turban, as God had commanded Moses. Moses took the anointing oil, anointed the sanctuary and everything in it, and thereby sanctified it. He sprinkled some of it upon the altar 7 times, and he anointed the altar and all its vessels and the laver and its base to sanctify it. He poured some of the anointing oil upon Aaron's head and anointed him to sanctify it. He brought Aaron's sons forward and dressed them in trousers, tunics, girded them with sashes, and put on their headdresses as God had commanded Moses. So he did this with Aaron, and now he's sanctifying the rest of them. Let's go a little further. We'll talk 52. As I said, we're approaching the end of this Torah portion, and the aliyahs here are going to be shorter. So now we're in the 5th reading. He brought the sin offering bull in front of the tent of meeting. There was a sin offering bull to be brought, and part of that is because Aaron had been part of for good intentions, but at least to the face of the nation, had been part of at least allowing or facilitating the sin of the golden calf. Therefore, they bring a bull as an atonement. This is something he lived with for his entire life. And Aaron and his sons leaned their hands forcibly upon the head of the sin offering bull. So Moses slaughters the bull now as an offering. Moses took the blood, ascended the ramp of the altar, and placed some of the blood in the altar's 4 protrusions with his finger. And as he walked around, then purified the altar. So the altar needs purification. It's almost, and the language of it is like it's like a sin offering for the altar. So there's some problem. An altar is an inanimate object, and we'll get back to that in a second. I'm just pointing it out. He then descended the ramp and poured the rest of the blood on the base of the altar, and sanctified the altar as an instrument upon which to effect atonement. 16. He ascended the altar again, took all the fat that is on the innards, on the abomasum, or alternatively on a small intestine, diaphragm, along with the part of the liver, the 2 kidneys, and their fat, and Moses burned them up on the altar. He burned the rest of the bull, its hide, its flesh, and its waste matter outside the camp, as God had commanded Moses. Okay, so let's leave it over there for a second. We'll go back to 18. Let's just make a note of what we're up to. When we go back to what's the purifying of the altar? The altar was it was holy. It was in a very holy place, a holy artifact, piece of furniture, a holy furniture where the offerings would be brought. It was really front and center in the holiness and in the approach of the people to connect with God, and God connecting with the people. So why do we have this idea of again purifying the altar? We could talk. I mean, maybe it's a little bit less jarring, but in the Hebrew, the language is the same language of a sin. In other words, to undo the sin of the altar. And v'chitesa, that like from the language of in the Hebrew, for some of you may be familiar with chet, which is a sin. So the Talmud tells us that as an insight, it's an insight for us for generations, that contributions to community welfare, to good efforts, that's a mitzvah. We should all feel responsibility. It's tzedakah. It's charity. It's justice. It's the right thing to do. If we have the capacity to help, we should help. God blesses us, and we should partner with God in making the world a better place. But in the effort to enable people, enable good things, and try to facilitate the support that we need to make good things happen, sometimes there can be pressure that's beyond their polite request and notifying of a need. If there's a need, and one goes to someone and says, "Listen, we have this need. Is there something you can do to help us?" There's nothing wrong with that answer, to that question. A person has the right to say no. And if they if there's something where you think that technically or generally speaking they should have said yes, that's between them and God. Sometimes there can be undue pressure, and the language uses the language of really coercion. It's pushing the envelope. So then someone gives that money because they feel the pressure, because they're feeling embarrassed or whatever it is. That money is somewhat tainted by the fact that there's someone's negative feeling about it. And if someone has negative feeling about their own contribution, the contribution is not so much a contribution. Our contribution should come from the heart. The contribution should come with goodwill, not with resentment. And therefore, we want to stay away from that. The onus is not on the person, the giver, as much because they feel what they feel, but I'm not putting people into that situation. Even back in the times of Moses, the understanding was that sometimes these offerings or the contributions were going to be ones that weren't totally free will. If God said to do it, that's something else. That's, you don't want to do it, but God said to do it. But we're talking about what the offerings that should have been free will and are in the rubric of free will, but really they've been pressured. People have had arms twisted. That, the Talmud tells us, that taints the altar, because its offerings are these are the things we're talking about as offerings, that these are public contributions, and that they're people are bringing things, and in this case it's to help feed the Kohens also. And if it came through undue pressure, then the mitzvah becomes somewhat tainted, and therefore the altar is the language of that God talks about here of cleansing the altar, means to cleanse it from this residue of offerings that were brought without the proper positive sentiment, but just because people were really beaten, not physically beaten, but they were coerced into it. And again, not physically, but pressure. So let's now go to 18. He brought forth the ascent offering ram. The Aaron and his sons leaned their hands forcefully upon the head of the ram. He slaughtered it, and standing on the ground next to the altar, Moses dashed the blood upon the northeast and southwest corners of the altar, such that the blood was considered to be encircling the altar. He cut up the ram in its constituent pieces, and after ascending the altar, Moses burned up the head, other pieces of the ram, and the fat on the altar. Before he descended the altar, he washed the innards and the legs in water, and only afterwards did Moses burn up the entire ram of the altar. So it's messy stuff, taking the innards of an animal, and Moses himself washes the innards. He burned it up with the intention that it's a pleasing ascent offering and fire offering to God as God commanded Moses. Let's just go to the bottom of the page, and then I want to go back to this verse. 22, he brought forth a second ram, the installation ram. And Aaron and his sons leaned their hands forcefully upon the ram's head. He slaughtered it, and Moses took some of his blood on his finger and placed it on the middle ridge of Aaron's right ear, and on the middle joint of Aaron's right thumb, and on the big toe of Aaron's right foot. He brought Aaron's sons forward, and Moses placed some of the blood on the middle ridge of their right ears, the middle joint of the right thumbs, and on the big toes of the right feet. Moses then, standing on the ground, dashed the remaining blood onto the altar at its northeast and southwest corners, such that the blood was considered to be encircling the altar, because you got all the corners. Took the fat covering the innards, meaning on the mesom and the reticulum, fatty tail, all the fat that was on the innards, and on the mesom, or alternatively on the small intestine, the diaphragm, along with the part of the liver, two kidneys together with the fat, and the right thigh. So now just go back to 21. Talmudic commentaries point out that Moses is doing this very, very important service, bringing offering to God in this very holy place. And for the sake of installing this holy class, the Kohens. So he's doing the service. Now, as part of this, you have to, it's messy, it's an animal. So you have to wash out of the innards. Someone else could have done it. But there is an idea that a principle that when one is connected to God, and one is doing a holy feels that one is doing a holy and meaningful service, every element of it is special, and there's nothing beneath us. What that calls to my mind is that when there was the yeshiva that's down in Morristown, started off in Newark. Uh, I left there when I was 2 years old. I have a memory of it. I left Newark, but there was a rabbi in Newark who later moved to Maplewood. His name was Rabbi Shalom Gordon. Some of you, maybe Helen, you might remember. But
yes, I went to school with Yossi.
Oh, that's right. So Rabbi Gordon, right? I know you had some connection there. So Rabbi Gordon was a very, very, very special man. He was a rabbi of a shul in Newark and Maplewood until he passed away. But I knew him quite well, and I remember hearing from people that when my father came to Newark to the yeshiva, Rabbi Gordon was a rabbi there, and he wanted to help. He didn't. It wasn't his job, and he had a big congregation there in Newark. But he is a Chabad guy, and there's a small struggling yeshiva with 12 students, and he wanted to help out, and he did. And I knew that all my years growing up. But someone told me, he said he walked in, and he saw Rabbi Gordon sweeping the floor, and the person said, "You're here, distinguished, respected rabbi. Why are you sweeping the floor? Give me the broom." So he said, Rabbi Gordon said to him, "If you want the broom, you can have the broom, but to sweep the floor in the Rebbe's yeshiva is an honor. I don't need you to do it. I can do it." And so there's a certain humility that comes with doing something that's so beyond us. Doesn't make a difference with doing something that the world sees, as society sees as a more esteemed service, or something that's just it's got to get done. If the objective is really what takes up all the space, then whatever we need to do. And therefore Moses specifically watched the innards, which someone else could have done. It wasn't technically a part of the service in that way, but it was something that it was instructive for generations. Page 53. And we're going up to verse 26, top of 53. Took one loaf of regular unleavened bread and one scalded loaf of oil bread, so-called because those loaves were made using the same amount of oil as the other two types of bread combined, and one flat unleavened cake out of the basket of unleavened bread that was before God. He placed them on top of the fats in the right thigh. 27. Then he placed it all on Aaron's palms and on his son's palms, put his hands underneath there, so he's like lifting it. And together with them, he waved the fats, as I mentioned last week, just like we have with the lulav and esrog. Some of you may be familiar, we do it all four directions, up and down, front and back, right and left, front and back. This was also done in all directions. And it waved the fats right thigh and the loaves, moving forward and backward in all four directions, and then upward and downward, thus making it all into a wave offering before God. Moses took the fats, the thigh, the loaves in their hands and burned them upon the altar, along with the ascent offering. He burned them up with the intention they be pleasing installation offerings and a fire offering together. Different, again, this is about the installation, but there's some other offerings there too. Moses took the breast of the installation ram, waved it in the same way that he waved the burnt portions, making it a wave offering before God. It then belonged to Moses as his portion to eat from the installation ram as God had commanded Moses. Now we're up to the final aliyah of this Torah portion, the seventh reading, and it's not a long one. Moses took some of the anointing oil and some of the blood that was on the altar. He sprinkled it on Aaron, on his garments, on his sons, and on his sons' garments. He thereby sanctified Aaron, his garments, his sons, and his sons' garments with him. Moses said to Aaron and to his sons, since the installation offerings are sacrifices of superior holiness, here's a process. We have to cook the meat inside the courtyard of the temple and east of the entrance of the tent of meeting and eat it there, along with the bread that is in the basket of the installation offerings, as I have commanded, saying, Aaron and his sons might eat it in this location. You can't take it home on the day they were offered up in order to be installed into the priesthood, because this is a superior holiness. It is to be eaten in the precincts of the tabernacle. You must burn whatever of the meat and bread that is left over the following morning. Now 33. We'll do 33, 34, and then we'll do the Chassidic insights. You must not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting, the courtyard, for 7 consecutive days until the end of the day that completes your installation days, meaning the 7th day, for we will install you in the priesthood by having you undergo these rituals for 7 days. Or as is done this day, so God has commanded me to do to you for the next 6 days. So it's going to be a 7-day process. Now, 7 consecutive days as part of the installation rites. And notice that the next 6 days as well to atone for you for anything you've done in the past that would be inconsistent with your priesthood. So it's a cleansing process as part of the installation. So now let's look at Chassidic insights for 7 days. As we have seen, and this traces back to years and years ago, we studied the very beginning of Genesis. It says that the Garden of Eden was a perfect situation. It was the physical world, but totally connected with God. There was absolute oneness. And if you looked at a tree, you looked at a frog, you looked at the world, you were able to see its purpose. You looked at each other, you were able to see its purpose. So Adam and Eve were created into a very idyllic situation. After they saw in a tree or in its fruit something that was more selfish for them and not why God had created, God said, don't eat from it. And they said, but it looks good to me. Then that shifted. The very palpable divine presence was no longer so palpable and divine, so clear. So one of the things that it says there is afterwards, right after their mistake of eating from the fruit, it said they heard God's voice. The language would be like walking, proceeding in the garden, but the Hebrew is funny. It's almost like skipping. It was not an even walk. The Hebrew is different. So one of the things the Mendy says is that God was jumped. What does that mean? So Hasidic thought tells us that God's presence was fully revealed and palpable in the human condition, and by humans unplugging from that perfect connection, God jumped up a notch. In other words, it was beyond our immediate grasp. And the Medrash says that over afterwards, the Cain and Abel, there are 7 different levels where godliness receded from the world. Not that it's not a godly world, but that it was a world where God's presence was it became very coarse, and became very very elusive for people to be able to tap into godliness, because they had pretty much shut God out of their lives. And it talks about 7 different levels. And then it says Abraham came along and he brought God a step closer, and Abraham and Sarah, and then Yitzchak and Rivka. So there's this process of bringing God into our lives, or the opposite. So this is what they're referring back to for 7 days. As we have seen, the divine presence originally rested on earth, but the misdeeds of successive generations banished it to further and further spiritual realms. We don't banish God, but I mean it's a word. I understand why they use it. It's the idea that we distance ourselves from God. We can't feel the godliness that's really right here. This process began to be reversed by Abraham and was consummated with the construction of the tabernacle. So in that Medrash, where it talks about how consecutive generations pushed God away from public consciousness, and then later generations brought God back into consciousness, the greatest, the final level of bringing godliness back to the world was through the tabernacle. Once they built the tabernacle, you were able to walk into to the tabernacle and feel God, similar to how Adam and Eve, or even maybe even greater than Adam and Eve felt. It was something that, meanwhile, at least at that level where there's a palpable godliness, like Adam and Eve. Thus, the 7 days of installation rites return the world to its original state of completion and holiness, the way it was during the original 7 days of creation. So, what is it? They've just dedicated a tabernacle. Now that they're dedicating the functionaries in the tabernacle. So those, at a certain level, from a certain angle, what we've done is we've created in the world a place, a physical place, a structure where we can experience the connectedness that was in the 7 days of creation. That connectedness. 7 days of installation rites return the world to its original state of completion. It's always the way it was in the original 7 days of creation. Thus, the Hebrew word for installation rites, and if you look, there's a Hebrew word there that means miluim. Miluim, to an Israeli, would have nothing to do with installation rites. It doesn't. The word and the Hebrew word essentially, and the translation, which is the correct translation, they're really not connected, because miluim literally means completion. It means to complete. Here was the completion of the installation rites. Miluim means to complete. Why we call it days of completion? Why don't you just call them days of installation rites? Because it was about completing, alluding to the fact that these days saw the world return to its original state of completion and holiness. It was through this, the tabernacle, through the installation rites of now having a tabernacle and functioning coins, and a place where we could have a true symbiosis of divinity and physicality in the world. We brought the world brought the world to its proper fullness, and that's why it's called the days of fullness, of completeness. If we look deeper, however, we can see that the 7 days of installation lives brought the world, we'll go to page 54, to an even greater level of completion than it possessed during the 7 days of creation, which I said before. In a way, we can say that this was even greater than the 7 days of creation. Why? In other words, the experience is greater than what Adam and Eve had. The divine revelation that accompanied the construction of the tabernacle was able to overcome the spiritual darkness that had spread throughout the world in the wake of the original progressive departure of the divine presence, not to mention the spiritual darkness into which the world was plunged by the incident of the golden calf. So similarly, by focusing our attention on so what he's saying is here, there's a relationship, and then there's the level of a relationship that overcomes distance. You gotta fight. So if you have an acquaintance, you're friendly, and then there's a falling out, you can just move on, unless the person really matters, and you fight for the relationship. And that expresses a deeper level of relationship. It shows it really matters. So the idea that Adam and Eve lived in a perfect connection with God was a honeymoon. It was beautiful. But the fact that we were able to restore that completeness after the distance and the darkness that it had, the 7 levels of darkness, it's not just to a level of where Adam and Eve were, it's deeper. Similarly, by focusing our attention on our mission, divine mission of making our lives into a tabernacle, an environment where God can feel at home, we bring ourselves to a higher level of divine consciousness than we possessed originally. Our return to God affects all our 7 basic emotions. We use the term 7 in Kabbalistic thinking. 7 emotions, the emotional attributes within the divine, we call them sephirot. They're God's building blocks. Divine building blocks for reality, and we reflect them in our souls in 7 different emotional channels. And so these 7, by going through these 7 steps, our return to God affects all our 7 basic emotions, just as the installation rites of the priests have to take place over 7 full days. So in other words, God and the world is godliness in our life, and we want to make our lives into a tabernacle for God. And we, just like they needed 7 days of purification to finish off the 7 steps of bringing divine presence to the world, we have to do that within ourselves. And emotions are very much the center of human operation. And the problems we get into are usually about where our emotions are pulling us, or how they're feeling about things. And therefore, to cleanse those 7 emotions and be able to align them with divine focus, with holiness, holy thinking, that's making our own 7 days of fullness, bringing our own inauguration. Let's see if we can finish this off. I don't know how far we'll get, but let's try. The final 2 verses are at the top of 54. He must therefore stay day and night for 7 days at the entrance to the tent of meeting in the courtyard. You must keep God's watch in order that you not die, for I was thus commanded, meaning that not complying with this installation ritual is a capital offense. Aaron and his sons did all the things God commanded them through Moses. And you could think Aaron and his sons did all the things God commanded them through Moses. Of course they did. These were very special people. God says something, they did it. What is the Torah telling us? So Rashi here on the commentary here, it says they did not swerve to the right or to the left, which is also a question. Of course. Why would they not do exactly what God told them to do? So let's look at this. 36 at the bottom on the left side of 54. Aaron and his sons did all the things that God commanded through Moses. It's self-understood that Aaron and his sons did what God expressly told them to do. So the import of this verse, as Rashi explains, is rather that they veered neither right or left from God's expression. This does not mean that they did not intentionally make any changes in anything that God had instructed. I'm not sure how their verbiage is a little off, but it's like, what does that mean? Of course, they didn't make any changes. This too is self-understood. Rather, this statement should be understood in light of the fact that God considered the tabernacle rites so complicated that he provided the priests with 7 days for practice and preparation. In this context, this verse is praising Aaron and his sons for not veering at all from the proper procedure, even during preparatory, or even during probably these preparatory days. Maybe there's something wrong here. Managing to fulfill every detail properly as God had commanded. So one way of understanding this idea that the Torah going out of its way to praise them, that they didn't go off, veer from God's command, when you talk about Aaron and his sons, is that there were 7 preparatory days. When you're practicing, you will understand that maybe things won't always go the right way, and we're learning, and the focus is probably going to be a little less intense than normal people as we're practicing on something. If a surgeon is practicing on a dummy or whatever, so of course you want to do it right, but it's not as pressing a need to do it right when one's actually working on a human body, a living human body. Aaron and his sons took this so seriously that even when it came to the preparation, they were very, very careful. They treated it as though it was not a rehearsal, but the real thing. Another way of looking at this. No, actually, before we do that, how do they manage such a feat? King Solomon stated, "No wrongdoing will befall the righteous." By wrongdoing, he cannot mean sin, even unintentional sin. For someone who's susceptible to sin cannot be termed righteous. The term righteous or tzaddik in Hebrew is a term that is a little elastic. Someone does something today, they did something very good. You say there are a bunch of good things. Say in a way they're a tzaddik, they were righteous today. Of course, they performed righteously. But righteousness or tzaddik is also used as a term to describe the subconscious. And the subconscious, that's very rare for a person to be at a subconscious level where they don't even have an instinct or a pull or even the thought of doing something wrong. That's, one in a generation maybe. So that's when King Solomon says, "No wrongdoing will befall the righteous." It means, in this, what we're saying is, it means the righteous, in other words, totally cleansed internally. So of course they don't sin. So what is wrongdoing? Rather, the righteous referred to by King Solomon are those who are in tune with divine energy, informing them that whatever it is they're doing, and thus they are automatically protected from even the slightest deviation from God's will, even one that would not be considered a wrongdoing for an average person. Aaron and his sons reached a degree of surrender to God. Their bodies were naturally attuned to God's will without even the most minor deviation. This is kind of a rarefied thought, and if they hadn't brought it here, I probably wouldn't be sharing it. But the idea is that's found in Torah literature that there are people who are so surrendered to God. They're like languages just like about Abraham and Sarah, for example. They were considered the God's chariot. What is a chariot? One of the things is that if you're driving a car, the car doesn't have a mind of its own. It's totally surrendered to what the driver is telling it to do by turning the wheel or pushing the brakes or whatever. There are people totally surrendered to God. Again, very rare. But they reach such a degree of surrender to God. And therefore, their bodies were naturally attuned to doing what God wants. And even if something could have been not a bad variation, but, in Torah thought, if I send have to send a document to someone in Liberty Corner, and I say, please bring this document to Jim, and his house is this road in Liberty Corner Road. I gave him a mission, and by Torah law, he has, by accepting it, he accepted to do exactly what I told him. But what if when he pulled up, he saw the guy wasn't at the address, he was actually across the street. So he gave it to him across the street. Does it mean that somehow he betrayed the mission, that he didn't fulfill the mission? No such thing. Because he fulfilled the mission. That variation is not a variation. So there are such things as variations based on what we're seeing on the ground. And it's not being offbeat. So God telling them what to do, there could have been things in the field where things would change a little bit. And that would be okay. But they were sensitive, so surrendered to God that even those things only happened if that's the way that God wanted it. I don't know if that was clear. The lesson for us here is that some people feel that at least as a start is enough to do just the big things, or the most serious of the commandments, while leaving the myriad details and minor laws for some later time. Torah therefore points out that Aaron and his sons, even during the educational days of setting up the tabernacle, were careful not to veer at all from God's express will. Because if it was God is the beloved, whatever God wants, they were surrendered. Every detail was by God's explicit instruction, making its exact fulfillment crucial to their task. The same is true of every detail of Jewish law and then every Jewish custom, for they too are integral elements of our divine mission. Okay. That's this one way of understanding what this idea of not veering to the right or to the left. Another angle on this, by saying that they veered neither to the right or to the left, Rashi is telling us they did not deviate even if they thought that a specific situation warranted a change to the right to increase holiness, or to the left as a further protection against the negative influences. To the right means to embrace something, to the left is used to distance. So here again, in the field, you have the God gives us the mitzvah. And they say, I'm going to do that, but I think I'm going to amp it up a little bit. And because I could use this mitzvah, I could do it in a more beautiful way, or I have to create protections so that we don't violate the mitzvah as a further protection against negative influences. Rather, they filled everything exactly as heard from Moses without regard to their own appraisal of the situation. Now, what does that teach us? The lesson in this case is twofold. Firstly, we should fulfill all of God's directions without regard to our own appraisal of the situation, even if we mean well. We have to be careful to distinguish. What does God say? The second, more subtle lesson is that it is only Aaron and his sons who are praised for not having changed anything at all. For they lived at a time, and they were in an environment of sublime spirituality in which extra caution was not warranted. In our dangerous times, however, there's a need for both types of deviation, to go beyond the letter of the law and to avoid even impermissible activities if such activities may lead to dangerous consequences. So the idea is, and I think we could have written this one a little bit better, but the idea is that Aaron and his sons, because they were living in a spiritual cocoon. Sticking with, we're not supposed to add to Torah. Let me put that back. We're not supposed to add to Torah. We're not supposed to detract from Torah. So someone says, I think Pesach is so great, or Hanukkah is so great, I'm going to do 9 days. That's not Hanukkah. Don't make it 7 days either. Hanukkah is 8 days. It's 8 days. And Pesach is 7 days in Israel, 8 days here. We don't make it 9 days. But at the same time, for us, we know our lives. And again, we use the term in the field. When we're actually in life, and we see that in order for us to be able to keep my kitchen kosher, then maybe I shouldn't even allow some things which are technically okay, but somehow, given my family dynamics, it's not going to lead us in the right direction. That's good. We should set up safeguards, not only for all things in our lives, right? Having alcohol in a house, not a problem. If a family member is someone who is struggling with alcoholism, of course I take it out of the house. I'm not saying that alcohol is today, but you have to put a barrier. You have to think boundaries to be able to help, enable proper living. So therefore, the idea of veering to the right or to the left within a certain rubric is okay, and it's even praiseworthy. We just got to make sure we're not changing anything fundamental. So I'll leave it over there. Next week we'll start the next Torah portion.
Mendy,
Yes.
I have 2 questions. Number
Sure.
1, I know I should know this, but I don't. How long how long after Adam and Eve were created did Eve eat from the apple?
This whole thing took just a few hours. It was Friday. They were
hours.
created on Friday. By Friday afternoon, it was already done. Yeah, we didn't live without mistakes for too long.
Do you remember when I used to say when God created people, he created them with a defect?
By design. You call it a defect. It's a challenge. It's isometrics for the soul. But yes, absolutely. We are created, we are very holy and pure inside, our divine soul, and we're put into a human personality that by definition has weaknesses. And life's one of life's important projects is to work on our weaknesses and try to minimize any damage from them and try maybe to support them and strengthen them.
The next question is, and I heard this, yesterday from a friend, and I didn't know whether it was true. If a Jewish woman is married to a non-Jewish man, she's not allowed to go to the mikveh?
That is an important question. And really I would say the reason I want to add it, I don't want to just answer that outright, is that there are different perspectives on that. And even within the Chabad community over the years, there have been different perspectives. And I wouldn't want to undermine or challenge anyone's. I know that in many of the Chabad communities in the past 10 years or so, it has become that, and certainly outside Chabad for sure in the observant world, that's really reserved for a Jewish marriage. That's the way it's seen.
She asked me that question, so that's why I'm asking.
They just say speak to the rabbi.
All right. And so I just want to note, I must have known you as a baby because the rabbinical college was a block away from where we lived. And I remember going there with my father as so.
I might have been that kid throwing food off my high chair.
Yep.
Yeah.
Who would think that 40 some years later, you'd be my rabbi?
Some years later.
No, you'd be my rabbi. Interesting.
A good trip for many years, God willing.
God willing.
All right. So I wish you all a great week. And we'll start the next Torah portion next week, God willing.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.